The wind had a voice that day. It howled low and steady, sweeping through the hollowed valley like a memory that wouldn't die. Snow, fresh from last night's storm, clung to the boots of the few townsfolk brave enough to step outside, leaving behind short, muddled trails that vanished as quickly as they were made. The sun struggled behind a gauze of pale gray clouds, casting no warmth, only the kind of light that reminded people winter was far from over. And in that light, she walked alone. Her name was Eleanor Bell. 26, pale-skinned, dark-haired, with the kind of eyes that had once been called hopeful. Not anymore. Her shawl was thin, her gloves mismatched, and her boots long past their prime, worn by too many winters and not enough kindness. She didn't belong anywhere, not since the war took her brother, then the fever took her father, and her mother simply stopped talking one day and never started again. They had buried her mother last autumn under a tree that had long lost its leaves. Eleanor had no family left, no one to write to, no one to wait for. But she had survived, and surviving in a town like Dry Hollow meant enduring stares like gunfire and whispers that sliced worse than blades. They called her a traitor. Not out loud, not anymore, but she heard it in the way women hushed their children when she passed, in the way men nodded without looking her in the eye. They hadn't forgotten the summer 2 years ago when she had nursed a wounded man by the riverbank, a man with dark braids and copper skin, a man in buckskin with a blooded Cheyenne medallion around his neck. He should have died there. Most folks would have left him to bleed out beneath the cottonwoods. But Eleanor hadn't. She hadn't even thought. She had just seen blood and breath and a life hanging by a thread. She had taken his weight on her back, hauled him into the cellar behind the chapel, and tended his wounds with trembling hands. She had listened to the fevered words he mumbled in his sleep, seen the knife scar under his ribs, the burn marks across his shoulders. She had bathed his brow, changed his bandages, and when the fever broke, watched his eyes open to hers. His name was Escu, and though she didn't know it then, that name would one day be all she had left.
She didn't see him again after that summer. He had disappeared one night without a sound, leaving behind a carved figurine of a horse and a single eagle feather beneath her pillow. She told no one. The town eventually forgot. At least they pretended to. But things had shifted. The preacher's wife stopped inviting her to Sunday supper. Mrs. Fenley at the general store started charging her a few extra cents for milk. Children stopped waving. Then came the quiet threats, broken eggs on her doorstep, a dead crow nailed to her stable. Now, 2 winters later, Eleanor lived in the back of an old barn she rented for pennies from the widow who pitied her. She kept to herself, worked odd jobs, took care of stray animals when no one else would. She didn't expect anything. Not warmth, not apology, and certainly not love. Until the stranger came to town. He rode in just after dusk, silent and alone, on a black horse that barely made a sound against the snow. His hat was pulled low, face half shadowed by a scarf and the falling flurries. He didn't go to the salon, didn't check into the inn. He rode past them all, straight to the chapel, then turned toward the woods. And for a brief second, before he vanished into the pines, he looked at her. Not just looked, saw. Something about the shape of his eyes, the stillness in his shoulders, the quiet heat in that one glance. Eleanor froze where she stood, a half-split log in her hand, heart pounding with something old and wild and impossible. Could it be him? No. It had been 2 years, and even then she had only seen him for a few weeks. Surely she was just seeing ghosts in the snow. But ghosts don't leave tracks. And the next morning, Near the edge of the woods, she found a small carved horse, fresh, smooth, warm to the touch, resting against her door. That night, Eleanor dreamed of fire, of screams in the dark, of her name shouted from the woods, of hands pulling her back as flames devoured a wooden cabin. She woke with a start, sweat on her brow despite the cold, and the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing through her chest like a promise unfulfilled. She didn't know what was coming, only that it would not be quiet, and it would not be merciful. But somewhere in the stillness, in the flickering candlelight that barely warmed her walls, Eleanor whispered a name, Asku, and the wind outside carried it toward the pines, as if it remembered too.
The next few days passed like snow falling on frozen ground, quiet, slow, and strangely heavy. Eleanor moved through them with a strange ache in her chest, something that felt too much like hope and too dangerous to name. She kept the carved horse hidden beneath her pillow. She didn't dare show it, not even to the widow who brought her a bowl of soup now and then. She simply stared at it in the early hours before dawn, tracing the familiar lines of the wood, the smoothness of the figure's back, the way the hooves were carved mid-gallop, like it had never meant to stop. She remembered how he used to carve them, his fingers rough with healing scabs, his breath short but focused. He said nothing while he worked, only paused sometimes to glance at her with eyes the color of storm-washed earth. And now he was here, or had been, unless her mind had made the whole thing up. On the third morning, while chopping wood behind the barn, Eleanor heard a sound that didn't belong to winter, the twig breaking. She froze. Then a whisper, low in Cheyenne, Ilano. Her breath hitched. No one else ever said her name like that. Not with reverence, not like it was something sacred. She turned slowly, and there he stood, Asku. His hair was longer now, pulled into a tight braid that reached past his shoulder. He wore a long dark coat, a strip of rawhide wrapped around his forearm. A few scars she hadn't seen before crossed his cheek like wind-etched lines, but his eyes, those still, steady eyes, were the same. She didn't move, neither did he. Then she whispered, "Why did you leave?" Asku didn't speak at first. He reached slowly into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a thin strip of cloth, stained but familiar. Her old handkerchief, the one she had used to wrap his side the first night he bled into her lap. He said, "I had no name to give you, only danger." Her lips trembled. She stepped forward, then stopped. Her heart knew this man, but her town, her world didn't. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If they see you—" "I've seen them." He looked past her, toward the ridge above the barn. 4 men, with rifles. They've been watching. Eleanor's blood ran cold. "They think I'm still protecting you." "You are," he said, simply. She wanted to laugh, sharp, bitter, exhausted, but it caught in her throat. Instead, she moved to the old trough and leaned against it, hands trembling. "I've never told anyone, not a word. I thought you were dead." Asku stepped closer, not too close, but enough that she could see the dirt under his nails. The cold pressed into his jaw. He held out something wrapped in leather string. A pendant, made of bone and turquoise. "Your father's land," he said. "They want it. They think if they hurt you, you'll give it up." "My father left nothing," she whispered. "You left something in the ground. They want to mine it. Silver, maybe." Eleanor laughed then. "So this is about land, not love." His face didn't change. "It's always both." She took the pendant from him without touching his hand. Their fingers brushed anyway. Then came the sound of shouting, male voices, angry ones, close. Eleanor stiffened. "They saw you." "I know." "What do we do?" "You hide." She blinked. "What about you?" He met her eyes. "I didn't come back to hide." Before she could argue, he turned and walked toward the woods again, slow, purposeful, like he wanted to be seen, like he was drawing fire away from her. And just before he disappeared behind the trees, he turned once more. "Trust the name I will give you." She didn't understand, not then, but her breath caught anyway, as if the wind had stopped just for those words. That night, a knock came at the barn door. Not hard, not loud, just firm. Eleanor opened it to find a slip of parchment, tacked with a hunting knife. One word was written on it: "Wife." The handwriting was crude, jagged, but it was his.
The morning sun arrived like a witness, quiet, golden, and too honest. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She kept the knife with the letter beside her on the barn's wooden floor, hands folded over her knees, eyes fixed on the wall as wind slipped through the gaps in the old planks. The word haunted her, simple and wild. Wife. Not a question, not a plea, a promise, a shield, a rebellion. By dawn, the townspeople were stirring, and so were the whispers. They had seen him, again, the Cheyenne, Eleanor's Cheyenne, as some spat with disgust. Not just a ghost from the war, but a living threat. They talked of stolen cattle, of land rights, of bloodlines that shouldn't mix. But mostly, they talked about her, about the girl who loved the enemy, about how she'd once housed him, fed him, healed him, and now he had returned. At mid-morning, the sheriff arrived. Sheriff Grady was a thick man, red-nosed and full of his own law. He didn't knock. He pushed the barn door open with the butt of his rifle. "Get up," he said, not unkind, but with a weight behind it. Eleanor stood slowly. "You been hiding him again?" "No," she answered. He eyed the pendant around her neck, the one Osku had given her. "You know what that means, don't you?" She nodded. "Then you understand how close you are to being run out of this place." "I've been close before," she said quietly. The sheriff sighed. He was tired, too. This wasn't the first time a woman in this town had crossed a line drawn by men who'd never loved anything more than their own fences. But Eleanor wasn't backing down this time, and he could see it. "Stay indoors," he muttered. "Storm's coming, and not the kind you can outrun." She waited until he left, and went behind the barn where she and Osku used to meet, back when the nights were filled with silence and a different kind of fear. She dug at the frozen earth with a rusted shovel. The ground was stubborn, but she pressed on until her fingers found what she was looking for: the tin box. Inside were the remnants of a time she had tried to bury.
A single eagle feather wrapped in cloth, a dried sprig of sage, and a name, his real name, written in Cheyenne on a slip of torn canvas. She could never pronounce it right, so he had told her, "Just call me Osku. It means one who watches the wind." She wept silently, not for the past, but for what was coming. That evening they came. 3 men, faces wrapped in scarves, rifles in hand, fear in their bellies masquerading as justice. They didn't knock, they shouted. "She has no place here. She harbors the enemy. She bore his mark, his baby too, I heard." Eleanor stepped out before the barn doors could be kicked in. She carried no weapon, just herself, and the name she now claimed.
You want me? She said. I'm right here. The men hesitated, not because she looked strong, but because she looked sure. And then a sound cut through the tension like thunder. Hooves. A single rider appeared on the ridge above the barn. The wind caught his coat, whipping it like a flag of defiance. Behind him, shadows moved. Other horses, other shapes. But he came first, alone. It was Osku. He didn't shout. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply rode down into the center of the dust, where anger swirled and fear whispered. And then he dismounted, walked past the three men as if they were children playing war, stopped in front of Eleanor, and dropped to one knee. In his hand was not a ring, but something far older, a carved stone painted with the symbol of his mother's people. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for her hand. He gave her a name, Eleanor Walking Wind. It was a naming, a claiming, not of ownership, but of honor, of kinship, of love that refused to be erased. The men didn't shoot. They couldn't. Something about the stillness, the sacredness held them. It was not fear, it was awe. One of them dropped his rifle. The other two turned away. And Eleanor? She stepped forward, lifted the stone from Osku's palm, and whispered, "Then I walk with the wind now." That night no one slept, and by morning word had traveled faster than horses. The girl who loved the enemy had become his wife, but the enemy, it seemed, was not the one with darker skin. It was the hate they had all fed for far too long.
The next few days passed like a hush laid over the valley. No one came to the barn. No one dared. Something sacred had unfolded there, something that could not be undone, and few had the heart to challenge it. Still, fear was a stubborn weed. The townsfolk did not speak Eleanor's name, but they whispered it. They stopped sending her bread, then milk, then warmth in the form of firewood. They turned their backs as she passed through the frozen streets. But she was no longer alone. Osku came and went like dusk, silent, dependable, bringing herbs, wild meat, stories without words. At night they would sit near the stove in the barn, the baby goatskin from his people wrapped around her shoulders. He didn't ask her to leave the town. He didn't ask her for anything. He only watched her, as if every breath she took was something he didn't want to miss. He showed her how to read the wind again, told her where the coyotes ran, where the snow would fall hardest, how to look at the sky and know when it lied. And then, one morning, he brought her a bundle. Inside, a cradle board, crafted with rough love, woven sinew, painted wood, and a soft lining of rabbit fur. She looked at it, then at him. "You knew?" she asked. He nodded once. "I saw it in your walk. You carry more than just your own body now." Her hand found her belly. She hadn't said it aloud, not even to herself. The swelling had been slight, but now it was real, named by someone who loved what the world hated. They didn't speak of marriage again, not the way townsfolk do. No papers, no rings, but in the old way, his way, he gave her a place in his bloodline, a song with her name, a fire he would keep burning for her long after snow buried the land. But the peace did not last. One night, just after the last frost melted from the barn roof, a knock came again. Not the sheriff, not a neighbor, a man from far away. Military coat, dull badge, cold eyes. He spoke not to Eleanor, but to Osku. "You're wanted by the territory marshal. They say you raided a settlement east of here." "I didn't," he answered. "Doesn't matter. You're Cheyenne. That's enough." Eleanor stepped between them. "He hasn't done anything wrong." The man didn't even blink. He survived. That's what they see as the crime.
Askew didn't fight, didn't argue. He looked once at Eleanor, at her belly, at the place where their child waited between worlds. "I'll go," he said. "No," she whispered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn feather, a symbol, a farewell. "If I run, they will burn this land. You'll lose everything." "I don't care." "You will. If our child is born without a home, without a name, the world will swallow her whole." The soldier took him, and just like that, she was alone again. But something was different now. She wasn't a girl ashamed of love anymore. She was a woman carrying proof of it beneath her ribs. She stayed in the barn that night, curled around the cradle board, holding the feather like a lifeline. But something inside her shifted, not toward grief, toward fire. The next morning, Eleanor rode into town. She wore her mother's boots and her father's coat. The feather was braided into her hair. She stepped into the sheriff's office like a storm held back only by skin. "Where did they take him?" she asked. The sheriff looked up, startled by her tone, by her fire, by the wind she carried behind her eyes. "To Canyon Ridge," he said finally. "Marshall's holding him until the judge arrives." "How long?" "Could be days, could be longer." She didn't flinch. "I need your horse." "What?" "I'm riding there." "That's a 3-day ride and you're—" "I'm not asking for your opinion, I'm asking for your horse." He stared at her, then leaned back, reached for his hat, and gave her the reins. She left that afternoon, alone, but not really. The wind rode with her. So did the memory of Askew's eyes, his voice, his promise, and the name he'd given her, the one that made her something more than just a girl who'd loved the enemy. Eleanor, Walking Wind. Canyon Ridge was a scar in the land, jagged cliffs and wind-scraped silence, broken only by the creak of a wooden jailhouse and the steel cry of ravens. Eleanor arrived just before dusk, the sheriff's horse coated in dust, her boots cracked, her braid undone. She had ridden straight, without sleep, without pause, without permission. The deputy guarding the jail leaned against the frame, chewing bark, eyes half-lidded until he saw her. "I'm here for the Cheyenne man," she said, voice hoarse but certain. The man stood up slowly. "You're the one they call Traitor's Girl?" "I'm the one carrying his child," she said, lifting her chin. "And I'm here to claim what's mine." There was no law for what she asked. But in that moment, there was no man in that dusty ridge who could meet her eyes. Inside, Askew sat on the floor of a cell built for wolves, not men. Shackled wrists, bruised cheek, but his gaze was calm, as if he had known she would come. "I told you to stay," he said softly. "I'm done staying quiet. I'm done hiding." She knelt beside the bars, reached through them, and took his hand. "I spoke your name to the wind. It answered me." The silence fell, not hollow, but sacred. And then, as if summoned by a force larger than justice, came thunder. Not in the sky, on the ground. Hooves, dozens, dozens more. Down the canyon trail came a line of riders, Cheyenne, Lakota, a few Arapaho, and behind them scattered settlers, women with babies, elders with canes, and children riding bareback, eyes wide and wild. At their front rode an old woman in elk hide, her face lined like the ridges behind her.
She carried no weapon, only a staff carved with symbols and years. They did not come to fight. They came to witness, to see what would happen to a man who had only loved and a woman who refused to forget. The marshal stepped outside, rifle in hand. "What is this?"
The elder woman raised her staff. "No tribe stands alone," she said. "No mother watches her son be taken for love." A murmur moved through the crowd like wind in wheat. The jailhouse creaked behind them. Eleanor stood taller. She turned to the marshal. "You can keep him caged, but you will cage me too, and our child, and every soul that dares believe in something kinder than this land's hate." The marshal looked at the crowd. No weapons raised, only faces, eyes, presence. Unarmed, but unstoppable. He lowered his rifle. "Take him, but don't bring this storm back to my ridge." They unshackled Osku. His legs trembled as he stepped out into the fading light. Eleanor met him halfway, hand on his chest, her body a shield even now. He said nothing, only kissed her forehead, and turned to face the ridge where he'd been kept like an animal. But now he walked free. As they rode away, slowly, with the crowd parting like a sea, the sun broke through a crack in the clouds. Light spilled across the land, golden, warm, soft like a mother's hand. Eleanor leaned against him. He held the reins with one hand, her hand with the other. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. A year later, the barn was still standing, but so was something more. A home, built on the edge of the valley, not far from where the town's fields gave way to untamed prairie. It wasn't grand, but it had a porch, and laughter, and the cry of a child with dark hair and eyes like the wind. They named her Luma, which meant dawn in his mother's tongue. Neighbors brought bread again, slowly, then apples, then quilts stitched in silence. Some hearts had softened, some hadn't, but no one spoke of betrayal anymore. Only of the girl who rode through snow and shame and silence to bring a man back home. And of the man who gave his name when no one else would. They never wore rings, but they carried each other's stories in their veins. Sometimes at night, Osku would light a small fire, and Eleanor would sit beside him, baby in her arms. He would sing, not loud, but deep like the river under ice. And Eleanor would whisper, "I never thought love would ride back." He would kiss her hand and answer, "It never left, it just needed someone brave enough to speak it." In the West, bullets travel fast, but love, if it's real, will always find its way back, even if it has to ride alone through 100 winds of dust.